What happened to the daughters of Pat Boone, the clean-cut crooner who once rivaled Elvis, sold millions of records, and built an all-American image of faith, family, and fame? While the spotlight loved him for his spotless shoes and gentle voice, at home, four daughters grew up watching a man who was both a national icon and a father trying to make sense of two very different worlds. For Debbie, Cherry, Linda, and Lori Boone, growing up meant navigating the strange duality of television dinners and primetime stages, where lullabies were sung in four-part harmony and life lessons came between rehearsals. And for each of them, the journey from childhood to adulthood followed a different rhythm, shaped not just by their father's legacy, but by their mother's quiet strength and by the parts of their own identities they refused to surrender. Debbie Boone was born in September 1956, the third daughter, but always the one with the loudest voice, literally. By the time she arrived, Pat Boone was already a household name, appearing regularly on TV, topping the charts, and walking a delicate line between pop idol and spiritual role model. But Debbie's early memories weren't about fame. They were about music. Shirley Boone, her mother, was a powerful presence at home. A singer herself, Shirley taught her daughters harmony at the kitchen table, conducting them through scales the way some mothers walk their kids through homework. Debbie quickly stood out, not because she wanted to, but because the voice was undeniable. It filled the room. It made guests turn their heads, and it made Pat look at her, not just as a daughter, but as someone with a gift too big to ignore. Their house in Beverly Hills wasn't like the others on the block. It was quieter, more disciplined. Church was a constant, as was family dinner. But there were also moments of chaos, cameras in the driveway, reporters at the door, and a father whose life oscillated between the studio and the pulpit. Debbie watched him work a room, then watched him pray at night. She learned early that presence meant more than performance, and that stage lights didn't erase the shadows back home. As the girls grew up, Shirley shaped them into a group. The Boones. They weren't just sisters, they were a harmony. Four girls, one sound. In 1975, they released the Boone Girls, a gospel-leaning pop album that surprised critics and delighted Christian audiences. For a moment, they were everywhere, youthful, radiant, almost too perfect to be real. Variety called their show one of the most talked about of the year. But behind the coordinated outfits and practiced smiles, things were starting to shift. Debbie, by then in her early 20s, began to feel the tension between group loyalty and personal calling. Her voice had grown stronger, her confidence sharper. In 1977, she broke away with a solo single, "You Light Up My Life." It didn't just top the charts, it burned through them. 10 weeks at #1, a Grammy headlines that now carried only her name. For the first time, Debbie Boone wasn't just Pat Boone's daughter. She was a star in her own right. But success, for Debbie, wasn't rebellion. It was responsibility. She married Gabriel Ferrer, the son of Hollywood royalty himself, and together they built a life rooted in faith, family, and stability. 4 children followed, so did more albums, more awards, and a reputation not just as a performer, but as a woman who held on to her values in an industry built on reinvention. But even with the spotlight on her, Debbie never fully stepped out of the family frame. She often said her stage presence came not from ambition, but from watching her father talk to an audience as if it were his living room. Her success wasn't a breakaway, it was an evolution. And behind that evolution was a mother who believed deeply in structure and a father who believed in God more than celebrity. Still, while Debbie's rise was orderly, polished, and carefully guided, her older sister Cherry was writing a different kind of story. One far messier, one no PR team could smooth over. And as the stage lights turned toward Cherry, the harmony started to crack. Cherry Boone was the firstborn July 1954, and in many ways the quiet center of the Boone family, long before her sister Debbie lit up the airwaves. As the oldest daughter of Pat and Shirley, she bore the early weight of expectation, not just from the public who adored her father, but from the carefully constructed image of perfection that surrounded their home. Pat Boone was rising fast when Cherry was small, transitioning from pop chart fame to family man fame, with a white-buckled smile that made mothers swoon and fathers nod in approval. But for Cherry, life under the Boone roof wasn't a stage. It was structured discipline, appearances. She grew up in the same harmonizing sessions as her sisters, learning to blend not just notes but behaviors, emotions, and doubts. While the public saw a family in harmony, Cherry was learning how to hide discord deep beneath the surface. By the early 1970s, as her father was shifting toward gospel music and Christian television, Cherry was trying to find a rhythm of her own. She sang, yes, and she smiled through it even when the Boone Girls took off as a quartet. But while Debbie leaned into the light, Cherry was shrinking inside it. The applause made her flinch. The cameras made her guard herself. She wasn't chasing fame. She was trying to survive it. Somewhere in the quiet between rehearsals and interviews, she started cutting calories at first. It was about control, one small thing she could shape in a house ruled by performance and propriety, but it quickly became obsession. Anorexia nervosa didn't have a name she recognized then. It just felt like ambition, like discipline, like doing something right in a world that expected everything to be flawless. By 1975, while Debbie was preparing to go solo, Cherry was slipping deeper into a silence no harmony could fix. She married Dan O'Neill, a man who saw her beyond the gloss, beyond the Boone name, and who also saw, early on, how far gone she already was. He fought for her when she wouldn't. He pleaded with her father, who couldn't yet accept that this wasn't a spiritual crisis or a bad attitude. It was a medical one. Pat Boone, America's wholesome icon, had trouble seeing mental health through anything but a moral lens. Dan had to push hard, not just for Cherry's survival, but for her dignity. And eventually, Cherry started to come back. Treatment was slow, painful, and lonely, but it worked. She wrote her story down in Starving for Attention, one of the earliest memoirs to speak openly about eating disorders, and in doing so, she shattered the illusion that perfection was protection. Her relationship with her father remained complicated. She loved him, she admired him, but she also needed to become someone outside of him. Cherry once said the most important moment in her healing came not from therapy or medication, but from letting go of the idea that her worth was measured by how close she came to being Pat Boone's ideal daughter. She became a mother, a writer, a woman who found peace not in performance, but in honesty. And though she stepped away from the stage, her presence remained a quiet anchor in the family, a reminder that love, to be real, had to make space for imperfection. Next came Linda, born October 1955, the daughter who would carry her own cross, not in private suffering, but in public devotion. While Cherry fought a silent war inside herself, Linda would later fight one for her son, against odds that would have crushed many. But in childhood, she was the peacemaker, the kind-hearted middle sister, always ready to smile, to step back, to play along. She sang with the Boone Girls too, stood in line at Sunday church, learned all the right notes, and for a time, it seemed like Linda's life would follow the familiar Boone blueprint: music, marriage, ministry. And for a while it did. She married Charles Michaelis and started a family. But everything changed when their son Ryan, then just a little boy, fell from a skylight, 3 stories, skull crushed, a coma doctors called irreversible. The prognosis was brutal. If he lived, he would never speak, move, or recognize his own parents again. But Linda, raised in a home built on belief, didn't accept that. She prayed, she waited. And when modern medicine stalled, she tried something radical: medical marijuana. Not out of rebellion, out of desperation. And it worked. Not a miracle, but a beginning. Slowly, Ryan stabilized. Slowly, he came back. Not fully, not predictably, but enough to go to church again. Enough to smile, enough to remind her why love sometimes means stepping outside the rules you were raised with. Linda's journey never made headlines, but it left a mark. She became an advocate for compassion in medicine, for seeing patients as people. While her sisters had battled critics or chased charts, Linda fought a quieter fight for the dignity of her child. And while her father might not have fully understood the choices she made, the strength behind them was unmistakably Boone. Each daughter had carried something different from the house they grew up in. Debbie carried the voice, Cherry carried the pressure, Linda carried the faith, the kind that bends when it must, but never breaks. And then there was one more, the youngest, the one who watched it all, said little, and chose a different path entirely. Laurie, the quietest Boone, but not the least, her story, though less told, says just as much. Laurie Boone was the last of the four, the one born not just into the music, but into its aftermath. By the time she arrived, the whirlwind of Pat Boone's chart-topping years had mellowed into something softer, more settled. The cameras came less frequently. The spotlight had shifted to Debbie's rising solo career, and the family's focus had become less about harmonizing for television and more about surviving the cracks fame had left behind. Laurie watched her sisters move through the world, Debbie ascending stages, Cherry retreating into recovery, Linda holding her family together in quiet courage, and she learned early that visibility came with a price. So she chose a different rhythm, one of distance, discretion, and near total privacy. While her sisters had experienced childhood under the harsh brightness of celebrity expectations, Laurie was born into a household that had learned to shield itself. She was still raised in harmony musically and morally, still taught to sing, still given the same values Shirley instilled in all her daughters. But Laurie wasn't drawn to the spotlight, not in the way her siblings were. If anything, she seemed to understand that the further she stayed from the public eye, the easier it would be to remain herself. That doesn't mean she vanished. In 1986, she made a brief appearance in the short film, No Alibis, a soft, largely forgotten project that gave her a small taste of the industry that had defined her family's image. But it was a step, not a statement. She didn't pursue fame after that, and she didn't explain why she didn't need to. For Laurie, adulthood arrived quietly. She didn't headline gospel tours or give interviews about personal battles. She carved a space that was, above all, her own, and that choice, that resistance to participate in the family narrative, the public thought it knew, became its own kind of statement. It said, not every child of fame wants the echo. Some are content to simply live among the Boones, where every daughter had once been trained to sing in perfect four-part harmony. Laurie was the one who turned down the volume. She wasn't the prodigy, the perfectionist, or the protector. She was the observer, and in some ways that gave her more freedom than any spotlight ever could. Her relationship with her parents remained close but carefully contained. Shirley, always the emotional anchor of the family, respected her youngest boundaries, even as she hoped for more public closeness. And Pat, older now, less rigid than before, having weathered the trials of each daughter's path, had come to understand that love wasn't about performance. It was about presence, even if quiet. When Shirley passed away in 2019, it was Laurie who stayed the most out of sight, choosing grief without public tribute. No open letters, no televised statements. Just silence, the kind that holds meaning without needing to explain itself. In many ways, the Boone daughters came of age in 4 different versions of the same house. Cherry grew up in the pressure cooker of early fame. Linda came of age in the era of spiritual idealism and family restructuring. Debbie found her voice at the crossroads of commercial opportunity and inherited expectation. And Laurie, the last, inherited the echoes, not the chaos. And yet, for all their different paths, there's a single thread running through them. A mother who believed in the power of music and a father who believed in the power of faith. The Boone girls didn't just grow up under their roof. They grew up under their ideology, one that prized goodness, restraint, and unity, sometimes to the point of suppression. Still, despite the weight of legacy, all 4 daughters built lives that, in one way or another, defied the script. Cherry stepped out from illness and into authorship. Linda turned tragedy into quiet advocacy. Debbie turned talent into independence. and Lori turned invisibility into peace. They may have once been taught to sing in unison, but they matured into distinctly individual voices, some public, some private, all deeply shaped by the paradox of growing up in a family where perfection was the product, but struggle was the soundtrack. Today, when people think of Pat Boone, they often remember the polished icon, the safe alternative to rock and roll, the poster boy for clean living. But behind that image stood four daughters who learned that image doesn't shield you from life. Each endured her own reckoning with fame, expectation, and identity, and each in her own way emerged with something closer to truth. Not a perfect truth, but a lived one. And maybe that's the quiet legacy of the Boone daughters, not the harmonies they used to sing, but the independence they earned when the music faded. Debbie still performs. Sometimes Linda's son continues to heal. Cherry's words remain in print, and Lori, wherever she is, continues to keep her silence sacred. They are not just the daughters of a star. They are women who grew up in the shadow of polished faith and found, in very different ways, how to become whole. If you found this breakdown powerful and want more deep dives into the hidden lives of Hollywood's forgotten children, subscribe to our channel. Your support brings these invisible stories to light. Thanks for listening.